Okay, it's mid-afternoon, lunchtime, so I don't know if I should say good morning or good afternoon, but you're all welcome to this public lecture by Professor Bina Agarwal. It's my pleasure as head of the Gender and Women's Studies discipline to welcome you all to this public lecture, which is being co-hosted by Chagas and Dublin City University. Professor Agarwal doesn't need much of an introduction because I am sure many of you in this room have followed her immense work for the last 3 decades on women in agriculture, women in property rights, women and governance, green governance. She has more than 100 publications and 13 books. So it's quite a distinguished career. I have known Bina over 2 decades. We started our association in India and have continued to maintain contact over the different moves that each of us have made across the globe. And I became fascinated with Bina's work because of her work on women and property rights and her well-known and distinguished book on A Field of One's Own, which was a path-breaking book on women's property rights. So for me, I am absolutely thrilled to hear Bina speak on another passion of mine, which is group farming. Because group farming is something that has been a practice in different parts of India. And Bina is now doing a systematic analysis of group farming, which is extremely, extremely important, particularly in the crisis of climate change, environmental crisis, etc. So can we learn some new ways of sustaining agricultural production and agricultural livelihoods in different parts of the world? She also has had a distinguished career because she has been president of many international societies, including being president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And she has won very important and distinguished prizes, which are many, which I will not name all of them. But I think the one prize, which is very important to highlight, is that she won the Balzan Prize in 2017, which is, she is the only second woman from the Global South to have won the Balzan Prize. And you will find her biography and her website, so you can learn much more about her. I won't take up your time anymore, and welcome Bina.
Wow. Nata, thank you for that's more than generous and somewhat embarrassing introduction. I think we know each other more than 2 decades. It seems like a lifetime. Yeah, really. So I'm so delighted to be here, and thank you all for organizing 2 amazing weeks of very good weather. So I warmly thank Nata Daburi and Anya McIntosh for their institutions, the University of Galway and Chagas, for hosting my wonderful visit to Ireland and for inviting me to give this talk. And I also warmly thank Yvonne Scottley, who teaches at the Dublin State University, for co-sponsoring the talk. And she's on the train, and she got a little late, couldn't get the first train. And so we hope to see her later today. And thank you, Gillian Brown, for your excellent organizational work, and everybody else who is in the background, unseen. I know how much work it takes for organizing a talk. So let me begin. I suppose this black thing will go away.
I think you can X out.
X. With the X.
Oh, I can do it.
Oh, right, of course, yes. Thank you. I'm going to talk about the case for farmers cooperating, lessons from India and Europe. because as Nata mentioned, I've been working on this topic for about 10 years, but actually in the last chapter of A Field of Unsown, which was published a long time ago in 1994, I did talk about the potential for people coming together to farm jointly because there's such a land scarcity in many countries, especially developing countries. These two pictures, one is a picture of women transplanting rice laboriously, and the other one is French farmers, as you can see, all women and all male, and therein lies a story which I will tell. I did some field work also in France, and so this picture is from there. Now, we know that informal cooperation among farmers is age-old. It's an age-old practice, especially labor exchange between households in peak periods for labor preparation, for harvesting, and for threshing. And it's called cooring in Ireland, it's called neighboring in Canada, and there are other names for it elsewhere, but both women and men played significant roles in what is one could call a mutual aid team. And there's a variety of literature, especially in the 60s and 70s, on this subject. Now, they were informal systems. They were based on reciprocity. So in some communities, often you would just have a team moving from field to field, suppose you were harvesting. But I found that in Northeast India, for instance, sometimes the accounting was pretty exact. So if you had an entire family, male, female, and children participating in this, then they would note down how many hours of male labor, female labor, and child labor had been provided by household, and it would be kept as a sort of potential reciprocal exchange at some point in time. One might mention that the end of this, especially in Ireland, from the literature I'd read, there would be feasting. So women not only participated in the labor, but they also did all this joint feasting for all the people who participated, and particularly the men. Now, what happened with mechanization and modernization of agriculture, that we find that labor exchange declined greatly by the 70s, as did the value of women's labor. And alongside, so there is that kind of decline. And at the same time, historically, alongside, we have more formal systems of state-supported or state-led cooperative forms which emerged. And these forms of cooperation are diverse globally. So the agricultural cooperatives, in a general way, if you use that term, have emerged to serve many purposes. So for instance, they could provide individual services of credit, of inputs, machines, machine sharing, marketing, or they could integrate fully into production units. And it's this one which I will then, that's a story I'll take forward. Now, the rules around this cooperation vary by country, by province, and sometimes by sub-regions. Most importantly, there was variation in the nature and level of cooperation, with a focus on different points or several points in the value chain, from when you start the production process to the end marketing and so on. Now, this is important to remember because often when we talk about cooperation or cooperatives, we imagine, yes, we know what we mean, but I thought it would be helpful when I created this table for people to see that there could be different levels. So the most common is what one would call single purpose cooperation, which is cooperation for input purchase and especially for marketing, and particularly for perishable products. But in the last column, as you'll see, the production was individual. So if we were all farmers, we would individually grow in our fields and then we would cooperate on certain things. Then there's single purpose medium cooperation. So for instance, labor pooling that I mentioned would be of certain operations, or you could have joint investment in private irrigation or in large machines. In fact, there is evidence from the early part of the 20th century, even in India, of machine sharing, of irrigation investments jointly by farmers. But today, of course, you have a lot of machine sharing. Then you have multi-purpose, what I call limited, and you could have collective crop planning. So there's a region, suppose you all want to decide you want to do organic, but you have to plan it with other farmers. You could do it for input purchase and then output sale. But in all these cases, as you can see, the cultivation is at the individual level. And finally, we have what I call fully integrated cooperation, which I use a descriptive term, group farming, not to, because other terms like cooperatives and so on carry a lot of historical baggage. So group farming is descriptive. You pool your land, labor, capital, you do joint cultivation, joint marketing, and a sharing of costs and benefits. And so that's the last one. Now, here are three pictures from India of the three levels. There's a single purpose one, the top one, you see these women in Northwest, in Western India in the state of Gujarat, which was among the earliest milk cooperatives in India, very large size now. I've given 3.6 million as a figure, but in fact, it's hugely expanded. Often it would be very poor women owning one animal or two animals, which is all that they could afford. But what the cooperative did was that instead of selling it to a local person who exploited them, the cooperative actually measures the quality of the milk, the fat content, and immediately pays you, because the women are too poor to wait for payment later. The middle one is planning in ecological zones. They're an NGO called Pradhan, which works across several states. And then the group farming in Kerala and other states, which is the third picture, which is fully integrated cooperation. Now, historically, of course, we have what I've termed waves of group farming globally. So among the earliest would be, one could say, the kibbutz in Israel around 1910 when it started. But that was more than just production, because in a kibbutz, you also had social integration. As you remember, in the early period, they had joint kitchens, children were brought up together, and many of these aspects then later declined, but the production part continued, and we still have those today. In the 20s and to the 50s, you had socialist collectivization, where land was, peasants were forcibly asked to collectivize, and then they became merely tools in a large team. And I'll come to that in the next slide. This happened, of course, particularly in the USSR, and then later on in Eastern Europe, with some variations across Eastern Europe. And then in the 60s, before we knew the negatives of socialist collectivization, there was the people were enamored because there was post-colonial countries. A lot of countries had become free of colonial rule in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and so they experimented within land reform. They experimented with forming cooperatives. I remember in India, I read about it anyway, that I can't remember at that point, but I wasn't there. But anyway, they did visit China, for instance, and you remember the Chinese were also doing collectives. And these farm collectives, by and large, didn't succeed. Now, some of you who work in Africa may know of the Ujamaa experience in Tanzania, but you had it, you have these examples across many countries, including India. In the 1960s, also parallelly, you had in France, Norway, Canada. Those are the examples I know from the literature. There would be others which started. I'm talking about group farming. It's a fully integrated, all operations are integrated. Then in the 1990s, you find that post-socialist, there was decollectivization. And many of the countries where the collectivized land was then redistributed to former members of the collective, they got little slivers of land, hardly any machinery, and many of them then collaborated with their neighbors and within the family to pool that land and farm collectively. There's quite a lot of evidence on that. And then in the 2000s, which is what I've been traveling and studying, UK, Canada, Ireland, there's groups, there's partnerships. Many of you here from Chagas would know a great deal about that. But this was on a limited scale. And also in the 2000s, you have another model of group farming, which is built on a very different institutional framework, which is the self-help groups. The background to which goes back to microcredit, if you remember. And I'll come to that, or why this is such a different transformative institutional form. Socialist collectivization had many negative features. It had many negative outcomes. The most important was that it was coercive, and then there was compulsory requisition of the produce. Obviously, if you see some of the pictures for Ukraine and so on, you'll find that there were very large farms, so there was no question of actually participating in decision making, and so you had vast production units, and farmers had very little voice in management. And then, surprisingly, I mean, if you look at that picture, that is a old socialist Soviet picture where men and women are seen as equal. But in fact, if you look at the figures, it was far from the case. A very small proportion of actually the tractor drivers, for instance, on these farms were women. In Vietnam, there's evidence from Vietnam and USSR and so on, that the work points that they got were very limited. So there was high levels of inequality, notwithstanding the rhetoric of equality. Post-colonial developing countries is interesting because these were supposed to be voluntary, and these were supposed to be new experiments in democratic spaces. And yet they failed. Now, my understanding of why they failed was because they had very little understanding of institutional design. They were supposedly voluntary, but there was pressure. They had targets, like in India, there were targets of how many you should make. And structurally, the problem was that if you bring large and small farmers, as all of you know, they have conflicts of interest and there are power differences between them. So the idea that an entire village could come together and cooperate, or the large and small farmers could do it, it seems to be intuitively incorrect. But in any case, there was mistrust, and there were no mechanisms of participated decision making, or for conflict resolution, or for ensuring that there's equal sharing of costs and benefits. In other words, the basic principles of successful cooperation, I believe, were violated, either by commission, which is, you pressure farmers to join, or by omission, by not taking into account that a degree of equality is necessary, social and economic equality is necessary among those cooperating. So I'll come back to what principles might work. And now, the motivation for cooperation, despite these stories of failure, whether it's a socialist or the 1960s, the motivation for cooperation persists. There's particularly land scarcity, farms are small. This is true for developing countries, but it is also true for Europe. So, for instance, 84% of farmers across 111 countries cultivate less than 2 hectares, and they face serious resource constraints. You find that the plot size has been falling and the holdings are fragmented. So if you can have a 2-acre farm, but if it could be in three plots, not in the same place. So fragmentation is not the same as farm sizes. And they have limited access to credit and technology. And alongside, as Nata also mentioned, we see climate change, limited non-farm jobs, and a feminization of agriculture. So this is quite interesting if you see that if it's going up, there is a feminization. If it's going down, there is a masculinization. And as you can see, Europe sort of stands out as a masculinization of agriculture compared to other regions. Now, one can update this. I couldn't easily find the way to update it, the statistics, but this gives you the overall trend. Now, this is percent females in the total agricultural labor force. And this happens, this feminization or masculinization, because say feminization, more men than women typically leave the farm, and in most developing countries, and they go to the cities, they're younger, they find jobs, whereas women are left behind because of reproductive responsibilities and so on. So you find that more women are left behind and as men move out. So this gender question, therefore, is extremely important. This is another part of research I've been doing, but I thought this slide may be of interest here as a complement to the feminization story. So although there's feminization and you have large numbers of farmers who are women, you find that hardly any women own land. So there are 2 indicators. I have some recent papers which I'm happy to share on India, but this is global. The top one is percent women who are landowners. in rural landowning households. So as you can see, except for Sri Lanka, which has a degree of bilateral matrilineal inheritance, in all the other cases, it's barely 10%. And then the second is percent landowners who are women. So in Bangladesh, 22%, India, 14%. This means that 86% of the landowners are men. And this is not just a story for South Asia, it's also for Sub-Saharan Africa. Cheryl Doss has done a lot of work on this. It's an average for 9 countries. And you can see that's average is 22. And similarly for Latin America, and you can see within the range. So in all cases, you find that there's huge inequalities and huge gender gap in land ownership. And it would be interesting to know what the figures for Ireland on this, but I'm sure that there is huge inequality. So where do people get land? Well, there are 3 main sources. There's the family, the state, and there's the market. Now, the family tends to be in most countries the most important because a lot of land is privately owned. So for instance, in India, about 86% of agricultural land is privately owned. And the transfer of that is largely through systems of inheritance and sometimes maybe of gifts and so on. And there's a huge male bias in inheritance. And so I and others have written a lot about it. So you may, even when the laws are equal, the actual outcome is unequal. So this, in this case, in India, the inheritance law is now completely gender equal. It was a civil society campaign in which I participated. And now in 2005, the law is, for the majority of the population, 83%. The rights are legally are gender equal. However, in practice, as you can see, there's huge inequality. Then you've had governments sometimes transfer titles to poor women when the government has surplus land. Surplus land can mean that in the early part of land reform in the 50s and 60s, what the many governments did in those, when I mentioned land reform across the developing world, is that they specified there should be a limit to how much land you can own, and things above that had to be were taken away by the government, perhaps with limited compensation. And that land was supposed to be the surplus land, which was then given to, especially to landless or near landless farmers. But effectively, again, you have to have very detailed country level data. So what happened in India was that instead of, because politically it's quite difficult to take land away from larger farmers and give it to the smaller farmers, they distributed a lot of common land. Now, we know common land is extremely valuable to the farmer and the rural community, and especially to women, because that's where you graze your animals, you get your firewood and fodder, and commons are also used for various other purposes. So if you distribute the commons, then and effectively most of it went to the larger farmers. This was the other thing. So what do we tend to say, well, you know, we tend to think as women scholars that markets are bad, but actually let's relook at markets. So normally markets are difficult for women to negotiate for land, partly because there's hardly any land markets. In, I think, 1%, in Ireland, I saw a figure that hardly 1% of land is exchanged annually, or in India, of course, it is also the case. That's very, very similar. Nobody wants to give away their land. It's their identity, it's their symbolic, it's their ancestry, citizenship rights, all of that is linked to that. Nevertheless, and also women don't have the financial resources to buy land. So we need to look at this. Can the government subsidize women's purchase of land, at least in terms of financial support systems, and also enable land leasing? But most of all, can we think of ownership, which is not individual? Can we think of ownership or even access, which is leasing in, as a group? We always think of property as individual, but does that have to be the case? So here a group approach can help farmers, and especially women, to access land and overcome constraints of small size and production. Now, these are 6 principles that I've extracted from my research of what is important for forming a successful group farm. Voluntariness, small group size, that is, you can't have like 50 people because there's lots of problems in governance. Economic homogeneity and social heterogeneity. Now, this is an interesting one because typically in collective action literature, in the social sciences, the emphasis on homogeneity. The more similar you are, the more you're likely to cooperate. But I found that that may be true economically, but not necessarily socially. Why? And I'll talk about it more later, but you have more social capital. Your social, suppose you in India, there's caste, but also by religion or ethnicity, you have more social capital if you're socially heterogeneous. So this is a shift from the usual standard understanding. Then there should be participatory decision-making, checks on free riding. And the free riding is if 6 of us come together and, and Nata always turns up for work, but she says, Bina, what is it? Why did you turn up 2 hours late? So there can be free riding because the task will be done. So there have to be checks and balances on that to be fair, and then fair and transparent distribution of production and costs. I've talked about this in this 2010 paper. What are the potential advantages of group farming? Now, I found it very interesting because I'd written this in 2010, and then I discovered something Anya, you'd written, and others had written in Chagas who'd also listed something very similar, parallelly. And so firstly, you get greater access to land. They can have economies of scale in smallholders. You can save on hired labor. So if you have 6 people in the farm working on the farm during peak periods, you don't have to hire in labor. You have better access to credit, to inputs and technical information. And the credit part I'll come to. And then you can have greater diversity of skills. You have more leadership talent. Not all of us have the same skills, and especially if you're women, you don't necessarily all possess all the skills. Then you can experiment with riskier, higher value crops with higher runoffs if you're consolidated. You can spread the risk among a larger number. And interestingly, I found there's better delivery on contracts because as a group, you're likely to deliver. So it both creates confidence in the person who signs a contract with you, and you can better deliver. And then it can raise bargaining power with governments and markets. As we know, all forms of aggregation do that. Then we can have easier adaptation to climate change. A lot of stuff that we think about in adapting to climate change or even mitigating it, whether it is a renewal of our soils or of our local forests or water bodies, you need groups. And in Kerala, in fact, there were a lot of ponds which had hyacinth. Water hyacinth had completely overtaken the ponds. And these women got together and they removed that. And they told the government, you've now cleaned it out and can be now used. But you couldn't do it individually. And then for women in conservative cultures, you have less restrictions on public interactions if you're a group and more autonomy in management. So especially in South Asia, for instance, women, you won't find women sitting in the local village tea shop and saying, hey guys, I have a farm, will 6 of you come and work on it? She wouldn't be able to do it, but if there are 6 of you, and you go and say, we need this support and so on, you can move around more because you have each other's support. And we find this in many contexts. Now you might say, okay, very good. We agree with you, though this is a potential. Is it really happening? So yes. So here's my case. So the most important is group farming in Kerala, which is in the southern part of India, the tip of India. If you see the map, it's on the left. And this was launched in 2000 under the State Poverty Eradication Mission of the government of Kerala. It's called Kudumshri, and it is continuing. Now, these are all women group farms who are constituted voluntarily by women from neighborhood groups doing savings and credit. So what they do is you take a neighborhood and you say you can come together and you can form neighborhood groups and you save. It's a model which is in many parts of the world. You save together, and then if somebody wants to loan a part of that, take a credit from that because they're doing something productive, then you can have a rotation of savings and credit. So you get to know each other. So once you've done that for about 6 months, then you can apply for a loan as a group if you want to do a group enterprise. And this is something innovative that the Indian government did. It's across India. The National Bank of Agriculture and Rural Development, NABARD. If you apply as a joint liability group, without collateral, you can get a loan and you have a joint responsibility. And that's been very helpful. Now, I want to emphasize these collectives are of individuals and not of family farms. So many of these women have their husbands and others doing very small plots, but they're doing their own farm, and the women also contribute to that. But these women's groups, the group farms, are separate from that. They come together as individuals. And they do receive a startup grant. They receive some technical training on organic fertilizer making, pesticide making, and some new crops. Now, I was very interested as an economist, although I work across disciplines, that we need to actually see whether these group farms are more or less productive than individual family farms. And so I did a primary survey in 2 districts of Kerala, and it was a sample of 250 farms in 2 districts, Alappuzha, which is a predominantly rice growing district, and Thrissur, which does commercial farming. 69 group farms, 181 individual farms. The individual farms were 95% male managed. So this survey was very, very challenging. I collected weekly data for every input, every output, for every crop, for every plot, for an entire year, sometimes 13 months. And every type of labor, male, female, hired, and so on, by operation. So it was, as you can imagine, it was a huge exercise for one person to manage, but I did that. It was in 2 states, but I talk about Kerala here. And then had focus group discussions. I had 4 MPhil students, who then went out and then asked the history and the decision making. How do they make decisions? Do they have any conflicts? Are there any farms which have broken up and so on? So the group characteristics, average group size was 6. They were all literate. 2/3 had done finished secondary school. They were all economically disadvantaged, but socially they were heterogeneous. They by religion and caste. All came from small landowning households, but only some themselves owned land. So you can belong to a household which has an acre, but you yourself may not. In those cases where the women in the group own some land, the group leased the land from her, so that she would also then be equal like everybody else in labor inputs. And these groups cultivate 1 hectare, and the individual farms cultivate 0.35 on average. So I have several papers on this, which are all open access. So despite all this support by the government, there were still disadvantages that the women's group faced. Firstly, because if you're leasing in land, you have to then walk around the village and you have to find out or use your social networks to say, hey, do you have land to lease in? Or sometimes they would say, my husband's brother's friend is in Dubai and he's willing to lease it. So it's a lot of exploration. So it's high transaction costs. Then leases are oral because technically, actually, you can't lease in land. It's banned legally. So what they do is you lease in land, but you don't sign a contract. That gives you insecurity of tenure. And that also means that you can't prove you're a farmer. So you don't get the government subsidies. And then they face, of course, we know that there are structurally embedded gender biases in access to land, to inputs, to extension services, and to markets. So there's quite a lot of global literature on this. FAO did this report in 2011 on women farmers, state of agriculture and women farmers, and they have a lot of evidence there. And importantly, this may surprise you that they had very little prior experience in farm management. So you might say, well, they're coming from farm families. Don't they know everything about farming? So here's the difference. If say your husband is managing the farm, then he's making the decisions, he's negotiating with markets, and you're working very hard, but you've never actually said, okay, we are responsible for management. And that's a very different, not entirely the same skill. And then dealing with absenteeism, these rules. So they made these rules. If you're absent, and you have a, if you're ill, then they'll say, okay, she's ill. But otherwise, you have to be replaced by a family member, or you have to pay for hired labor, or you have to pay a fine. So they were pretty strict on this to make sure that everybody was seen as equal in terms of labor inputs. So what did I find? So here's what I found. I was actually totally taken aback by the results, because when you collect such detailed data, you often wonder what you're going to get at the end. So there's quite a lot of econometric work I did, but this is broadly to share with you this slide. The first line, annual value of output. And that row, you find that the group farms had 1.8 times the annual value of output relative to individual family farms, which is there, 101, 156. This is in rupees. It's about what, 85 to 89 rupees per euro. Then interestingly, they also specialize, many of them, in banana, and the banana yields, as you can see, were hugely profitable as well. And then annual returns. Annual returns means that you deduct the paid out costs and what is left over. Not the cost of own labor and land, but everything else. And I found that the net returns per farm in the groups were 5 times more than per farm in the individual family farms, which were largely male managed. Per hectare, it was 1.6 times. Now, some groups were able to make enough profit, and especially in Thrissur, where they were in commercial farming, to actually buy some land as a group. So these results are for those who do a lot of econometrics. All of that is in this paper, the World Development paper. But also importantly, there were a lot of indirect benefits. So they learned to manage farms, make production decisions, they learned new technical skills, and then they became familiar with a wide range of public institutions. So I'm citing here, one of the groups said, before joining the group, we had no contacts with bank officials, agricultural officials, or government officials. After registering as a group farm, we could start a bank account, attend training classes, and develop a good rapport with these officers. Then they learned to negotiate in multiple markets, input markets, firstly the land market, input markets, crop sales, and so on. And then what's very important, and I think even in the Irish literature, I've read how important this is that the women develop strong identities as farmers rather than being seen as farm wives. And so this is another woman I cite. Group farming has enriched my farming experience. I realized that I have good leadership qualities and could also manage the technical aspects of farming. And what was very interesting is that some of the women said, now the men ask us what we should do sometimes. So they felt that they were the knowledge takers and now they're knowledge makers. And for them, that was a matter of great pride. Then they got great respect from family and community. And then the last one is very interesting, that they began to stand for village council elections and winning. In fact, they were so winnable that most political parties would like to have candidates from Kudumshri for this purpose. Okay, now, so this is a good story. And then you have Telangana, where I want to share this. This was less successful. This is another southern state of India. And here it was launched in 2001 by UNDP and the government of India. And it was implemented by CASA NGO. And the project built on pre-existing groups. Women's groups were formed in many villages where it was for education for women's empowerment. And these are very large groups, 20 women on average, and all were poor and all were caste disadvantaged. And they also got a seed grant, they got support but it was only for 5 years. So I did simultaneous research between Kerala and Andhra, and here it was 763 farms in 3 districts. And these groups cultivated an average of 2 hectares of leased land, and individual farmers at 1 hectare. Here I found that the group farms had lower levels of annual value of output, but they were equivalent if you took a commercial crop like cotton, and they had equivalent net returns because they especially saved on hiring. And again, you find that the groups were socially and economically empowered. They also stood for village council elections and won. So then you'll ask, well, why did Kerala's groups perform so much better than Telangana's, obviously? And this is an important question because we learn both from stories of success and stories where we are less successful, right? So I've listed 5 things. Firstly, state support. In Kerala, it has been a continuous level of support. The government doesn't help you lease the land. But what it does is it provides support in terms of training, new people enter and so on. And in Telangana, it was support for only for 5 years. Then the group composition, Telangana was like 20 on average, Kerala was 6. This is very important because, smaller groups are easier to manage. And the social heterogeneity in Kerala was helpful because in leasing in land. If you're caste disadvantaged in India, and your social base is just among the same, then you're not being able to lease in land because everybody else also doesn't want much land. So that was an important thing. Production conditions, commercial crops matter. I mean, there is this, within civil society, there is this assumption that if you want to grow, if you want to be food secure, you should grow food crops. But then they're not necessarily the most productive, and you have to have very good land for that. So I think, disadvantaged groups really face a disadvantage there. So we need to, I'm sympathetic to both arguments, but I think to make a living, they might not want, that might not be the best thing to do. And then there are some institutional structures, which I won't go into, which Kerala had. They were federated. They had an institutional spine. So groups had representatives at the 2nd level and 3rd level, so that you had that. And conceptually, Kerala saw this as an economic program with social outcomes. Whereas in Andhra, and at that time Andhra, but Telangana saw it as a social, there was a social program and they grafted the economic. And the two don't necessarily work together. You need large numbers for social empowerment, but you need probably small numbers for economic empowerment. So elsewhere in India also, partly as a result of my writings, you have group farms emerging in Eastern India and Nepal, and we have a paper on that. And here again, we find that there is economic efficiency, they're able to do irrigation, and there are other advantages as well. And then there's all women group farms in Western India. I did a workshop with some of the NGOs, and they thought it was an interesting one to use. What is interesting is during COVID, that the group farms in Kerala survived hugely better than the individual farms. So the 87% of them survived economically, while large numbers of individual farmers lost out. And so that's an enormous number of 30,000 who were doing that. And in Eastern India, Eastern Western India, new groups are formed. These were some interviews we did, and they said that we are much more food secure than if we had continued with individual farming. I think in terms of crisis management, this is a plus. And this is the idea of scaling up. So you can have, neighborhood groups, you have a lot of joint group farms, and then you can federate it and form for marketing and other purposes, you can have farmers produce it. Beyond India, is there group farming elsewhere? So yes, Europe. So this is something you would be interested in. And, it's really been increasing. So France, in the 1960s, there was a young Catholic farmers movement prior to that, in which they said they wanted a new kind of agriculture. We didn't have all the ills of capitalism, nor all the ills of communism. So they wanted something which was community-based and driven, something in between. So this whole GAIC, this group farms, was launched at that point in time. And today there are 91,000 group farms in France. And this is escalated even since I started looking at it, covering 21% of all farms in. GAICs are somewhat different from EARLs. EARLs is a more business model. GAIC is a more egalitarian model. And this is particularly in animal livestock milk. Norway also has group farms, but a smaller number. The latest figures were 634, all in livestock. And Romania, where we've done work, the agricultural cooperatives, you remember I said that after decollectivization, they formed groups. So we went back, a colleague and I went back and with a Romanian partner to see what had happened to these farms. We saw some had declined, some have persisted, and some new ones are coming up. They're not as large a number as in France. In UK and Canada, these are some pictures. You might recognize me here and there. That woman with the hat is me. So there are two types of farms which are value driven. You can call them group farms because they do everything together. The left one is Cannon Farm. And as you can see, it's very traditional, 20 families who work together and share everything together, and they live together and so on. They do have non-farm incomes to an extent. That's my colleague, Steve, here. And these are two people, Chris, and so they are working on Cannon Farm. They give us a lot of time. On the right-hand side is a Canadian one, which was one of the oldest group farms. It was called, in Saskatchewan, it was called Matador. It was set up in the 1940s by war veterans. And then they went through 3 generations. And today, the Hutterites have taken over. And as you can see in the background, far background, it's extremely mechanized, extremely efficient. They make huge profits. But the bad part is that's huge gender segregation. So the women do they're not allowed to drive the tractors or do any of the technical stuff. They manage the social stuff and the food and other things. So these are some examples. Okay, so if you compare India and Europe, suppose you take India, France, Norway, Ireland. So these are some broad differences. So in India, it's active and growing. There are over 73% group farms, if you take all India, beyond Kerala also in 2023. They are mostly women managed. They're all women groups, and some are mixed gender groups. They're constituted of individuals and not families. The plots are small. They do crop cultivation, tillage, which is many other farms don't do. And there are no restrictions on non-farm work. In France, I've just given you the figures. They are mostly male managed. They're all male or mixed groups. They're constituted of family members or unrelated individuals. But the family members that are constituted are not necessarily father and son. They can be brothers or cousins. They have medium to large plots. They do animal breeding. They also do tillage, but it's most of them are more concentrated in milk and in dairy. And there are strong restrictions on non-farm work. So you can't do more than 10% of your time in non-farm work. So what that means is that you have to get all your subsistence from the farm if you're 4 people, for instance. And that means the farms can't be very small. And then Norway is a bit like France, and then Ireland, from what I could gather. I'm a bit embarrassed to talk about it with such a distinguished and well-informed people from here. But here are the figures that I have. It is 3562 partnerships, which I got from my colleagues in Chagas. And there are out of 135,027 farms, which is 2.7% in 2021. Mostly male managed. Partners are mostly family members, father, son, and there are no restrictions on non-farm work. So in a way, one can see that group farming can work for both small and medium-sized farms. As you can see, India is very small, France has medium-sized, European Union has both kinds, and there's Ireland, which is, again, a fair proportion of small farms. So are there models which you could work? I mean, when we look at these models, I know I'm running out of time. So I thought this slide is important. So I prepared this slide for our talk. And so the green part is the major differences. And is there cross-learning possible? This is controversial, and please argue with me. So the yellow ones are what we can learn from, kind of. And so if you see, India and France have very large numbers. Ireland, it's growing, but it's quite small at the moment, 2.7% of farms, 3,500 roughly. Land scarcity is very high in India and Ireland. It's quite low in a way in France because they lease in quite a lot of land. And the family or non-family. Now in India, it's non-family farms. In France, it is mostly family, but they are not father and son. And in Ireland, therefore, my question is, can you have family without just focusing on father and son. So succession has been a very important factor, as I understand in France, as motivating farms, but can be learned from any other model. The number of partners are small, which is good. Gender, very good in Kerala, not so good in France and Ireland. So that requires work. And then is non-farm allowed? Everything is pooled in all cases. There is equal sharing in India and France, and in Ireland, it's unequal shares. And non-farm is allowed in India. It's not allowed very much in France, and it's allowed in Ireland. So in Ireland, you still have farmers who might be working full-time in non-farm work, and then they could, they might move increasingly towards farming, but still a lot of your time goes into non-farm work. And then in India, it's mainly crops and it's mainly livestock in Ireland. But that depends on ecology. So there's not much to learn from that. It really depends on local conditions. And the main motivation, again, is something we could learn from because it's economic and other in India and France, but it is mainly succession in Ireland. So is it the potential advantages? Is there something that the model can be tweaked beyond succession to focus more on the economic? And then there are incentives. There's not huge numbers of incentives in India, and both France and Ireland have EU incentives for young farmers. You have tax incentives. Irish government itself has a lot of incentives, and so on and so forth. Summary. So globally, there are many reasons for farmers to cooperate. There's resource scarcity, land, labor, and capital. There are economic benefits we know, which are listed. There are social benefits. Work-life balance is very important. I haven't mentioned that very much before, but if you're doing dairy farming, it's just impossible. You're there all the time. It's like having a baby, you have to be on call, and so with the animals. So the French farmers often mention that that's the way, if we have a partner, at least we can take a holiday, or we can, some farmers don't even get married. In France, I think that a large proportion don't get married because of, no woman wants to come and be full-time working so hard. So there's that. There's environmental protection, regeneration is possible, and climate change, we need groups for that. And then we have this post-COVID, should we focus on local short value chains, local food systems. But my plea is that to bring about a shift from individual to group farms, we will need global sharing of success stories. We need to be carefully look at the design principles of what works. And we need state and civil society support. Now here, both France and India could provide lessons, but I also recognize that the kind of support that the Agriculture Ministry and Chagas are jointly doing in Ireland offers a lot of potential for rethinking. And then, of course, the final reason for working together is you make for happier farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina, for an absolutely brilliant talk, which is vast in scope and absolutely inspires a lot of thought of what is the way we should move forward in agriculture. So I'm sure there are hundreds of questions.
I'm very happy. And disagree with me, by all means.
But I think what we will do, Bina, is
Take
Chaga's
Chaga
colleagues are online, many of them,
Yes.
and they tend to leave after an hour. So we'll take some of their questions first. Are there questions on me?
I'm up there. I don't think there's anything up there yet.
And if anyone is online and wants to speak
Yes.
up, please.
They can speak, yes.
Yeah. So while we wait for Chaga's colleagues online to raise questions, let me open it up to all of you. So any questions?
I'd like to make just a few comments. Thank you, Bina. It was fascinating and really a privilege to hear you speak for our uninterrupted. There's plenty of discussions. Now I wish I actually stayed quiet for longer. In relation to the Irish context, excuse me, The research I did was a number of years ago, the case studies that you referred to earlier. And, you know, echoing what you noticed in India and other contexts, definitely this disruption of the link between land ownership, often in male hands, male ownership, the disruption of the relationship between ownership and the professional identity of farmer. So that has been hugely transformative of relations within farm households and the profile of professional identities in agriculture in Ireland, not just to include women, diversify to include women, but also youth and the landless. So those who actually wish to become a farmer without coming from a farm family at all. So that has been hugely liberating and empowering and diversifying and has benefited the agriculture sector greatly. You know, it's just your presentation comes across, it's a very positive portrayal of group farming. And one might question, well, how is it so positive? But we have found in the Irish case that it is incredibly positive. And almost if you want to test that, say, if we used, if Anne is here today.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, she here. Anne,
Yes.
oh yeah, Anne Byrne. Yeah.
And Burn.
You know, we said, well, how are these strategies employed by these farmers engaged in collective farming? How do they compare with, say, strategies of resilience? You know, for instance, Unger's criteria, and they map perfectly onto these. So, you know, it is valid to make this very positive portrayal, equally of empowerment of women, even, you know, the solidarity aspect, the conscientization aspect, looking at the trajectory of development of women, it maps perfectly. One thing that I haven't published yet in the case studies is an analysis of case studies of those who actively considered farm partnerships, but decided to retract from the decision. And I chose those because they were aware of farm partnerships. Lots of farmers, and how aware are they of farm partnerships, the potential of farm partnerships? That's a fault of, say, policy and Teagasc to an extent, because, you know, it's not exactly top of the agenda. But those who really did consider them, and why did they back out, or why did it fail, even at the contract negotiation stage? So we have 8 case studies of those. And what they, just to apply those theories of resilience and empowerment again to those case studies, show that there were flaws, gaps in the decision-making process, perhaps the socio-cultural conditions, perhaps relationships within the household and between the household and the community. They could actually be explained by failures in those paradigms to map onto those cases. So that's just more evidence, just in relation to the kind of the good news story. Well, I think it is quite authentic as such, as you've shown.
Thank you.
Interesting. Thanks, Bina.
Thank you. So we have we have to just gather all together, all of us who believe that this is a way forward. I just wanted to say one small thing on, you know, in this very detailed work I did on France, which I haven't published, it's a report on 2 provinces for a whole year. It was that, you know, in France, they actually, on decision making, we took a lot of time in finding out, and they have much more formal, they have formal and informal decision making. So suppose you have 4 partners. One model is that each partner, somebody is doing dairy, and somebody is doing meat, and somebody is doing tillage or even just silage. And so you have different responsibilities, but they do have checks and balances, and when do they meet, they keep minutes. In some big cases, they keep minutes. And then their relationship problems. So they have it's like prenuptial. The Ministry of Agriculture in France gives you a 3-day training to be warned about what the problems could be in relationships. And then I also interviewed and met with 3 private individuals who make a living out of helping Gaiaks with relationships. You know, they were able to do, they were psychologists. And they have all these cases. And sometimes farms do break up because of personality issues. But there's one thing which is very interesting. I thought Ireland could consider that for succession in the French model, they bring in an apprentice. So it could be a cousin, or it could be a nephew, niece, etc., or it could be a complete new person. And when the person has been with them for 6 months, 8 years, or a year, and that person is young and is willing to be a partner, then they could take advantage of the young farmers scheme in the European Union and then join them. So when I talk to people, you and others, there's a sense that, oh, this can't happen in Ireland, but I wonder, because that could expand the farm size, right? With succession, you're passing the same land to the son, whereas if you have neighbors who come together who trust each other, it's a question mark. It's to be considered. Thank you.
Other questions?
I'm Mika, a postdoc researcher at Chagask. I'm interested in the social capitals, and I've seen the theories and etc., but I'm not sure in the field what's going on. And so, in my opinion, having a network not only within the community but also with the outside of the community or region or whatever is very important. And I think it can be one kind of social capitals.
Yes.
So, in your opinion, what kind of social capitals could be found as strong influential factors for this group farming or collaborative farming?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So there are two types of social capital. One is that in Kerala, and they have neighborhood groups. So if you're a neighbor, you're less likely to default, than otherwise, because among women in particular, the exchanges are not just on the group farms. They might borrow sugar if they're short of sugar, or they might go for some other activity together. So they build neighborhood group social capital. The second is the point I made, which is that they moved away from the standard model of homogeneity to say, let's allow heterogeneity across religion and caste. Now, in India, caste is, there's a totally disadvantaged caste where women from upper caste will not even take tea from them if it's really strong. So how did Kerala deal with that? I asked them. And the way they dealt with it, they said, if there are 6 people, we'll rotate the meetings, monthly meetings in each person's house. So in some cases, the upper caste women said, well, we'll come, but we're not going to have tea. So they were basically told, look, this is not okay. And you don't have to be in the group. And you can decide whether you want to be in the group. And they got over it. I mean, the economic benefits and other benefits so much that they stayed on. Same with Andhra. Well, in Andhra, it was less of a thing, because in Andhra, why it didn't work so well was partly because they were all caste disadvantaged and poor. So as you said, your social capital was limited, your base of social capital was limited.
But that raises another question about scaling up.
Scaling, yeah. Okay.
Because there are challenges. Okay, you can have a model like this works very well in a particular neighborhood. But she's talking about expanding your social capital by reaching to other regions, right?
Well, there are two, again, there are two types. Firstly, we tend to think of scaling up, there have to be thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if you look at, the way you need to scale up is for production unit has to be small. And then what Kerala and even other states have done is that they have representatives from the village level. So suppose you have 6 groups and you would have 1 representative each. And then you form at the block level. And then they send a representative at the village council level.
Okay.
So that is a form of scaling up. And the second is that, I don't know if you have it here in Ireland or not. We have farmers' visits, learning from other farmers. So you'll have a group from one region going to another region and seeing, when a researcher tries to tell you something, you're not able to ask all the questions. But when you ask another farmer or set of farmers, so for instance, I know that in Ireland in the 1995 or so, there were people from Ministry of Agriculture, or maybe they went to France and they looked at that model and said, okay, well, this will work and this will not work. But that's at a one person level. But I would suggest, why not take a group of partnerships to France, and just so near, and see what the Gayaks have to say. And they can ask each other difficult questions. Yeah. That's another way of
Yeah.
scaling up. Remember when Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate in economics, the first woman Nobel laureate in economics, she talked about nested communities.
Yeah.
Because these groups will be small, but then you link up.
Yes, and I think you can talk about scaling out as opposed to scaling up as well.
Yes.
But I thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. And I really think, it was an example of, we're always talking about these transformative change. And it is an example of something that is very different, I think, even though it came from the past. And I do remember my own grandmother's farm where neighbors came in for saving the hay and, helping each other out in Galway. But yeah, no, I mean, this isn't really a question, but I suppose it's about transforming the norms and the mentality and the view that it's individualistic. That's the challenge. And how do we actually do that with supports? And some people would kind of, you kind of think, well, what is human nature? Is it human nature to be cooperative, to help each other, or is human nature to be capitalistic and, individualistic or whatever? So, it goes down to that. And I was thinking also of attempts at housing cooperatives in Ireland, and it was very difficult. But then I mean, I don't know enough about it, but maybe it's to do with the supports that are there and the encouragement from outside the groups. So that's just, but how do we shift this kind of?
I think one of the issues which always comes up is really the topography. So for instance, Indian villages, people live in the village. Like English villages, you live in a village and then you have your fields around you. Whereas here in Ireland, in Canada and so on, you have a farmhouse and then you have your fields around you. So there are distances. Now you may meet in social clubs or social occasions in the village, but that neighborhoods can be very large. But it's not, it can be, that challenge can be overcome. After all, farmers from all over around then bring their things to the farmers market. They get to know each other, they form relationships. So, but if we proactively recognize that this could be difficult, then one could say, okay, can we bring them together and see if we can form this? The other thing, and thank you for the scaling out, you're absolutely right. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the model, people talk about microcredit and there's a lot of controversy. It's worked in some cases, not worked in others. For me, microcredit was important not for the credit part of it, but it's important for the institutional part. So when Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh in the early 70s talked about microcredit, Grameen Bank, he said there are principles. You have to have 5 women, they all have to be poor, they have to have individual loans, but group liability and so on. So there's an institutional form they created. Across South Asia, and especially India, you had then what we call self-help groups, which do savings and credit. And then the shift would be that that Kerala did was to have group enterprises. So you can have saving and credit, can go on for years. But if you say we're going to, it doesn't have to be group farming. You can set up a tea shop together, or you can have a labor team. And that model, therefore, I think was an important innovation and institutionally. And that is what underlies this important, potential. And if we design it carefully, this is, that 3 men in particular were very focused in helping to design some of these principles. And there were also women bureaucrats, but 3 men who. So I interviewed them. There's a paper, Canadian Studies paper, where you'll find, I asked them all these questions: why only women? Why this? Why that? And they answered. Yeah. Yes.
I have more of a practical question when it comes to the coordination and the participatory model. So is it more, in your experience, from what you could have seen, is it more flat hierarchies that work or more vertical hierarchies that work? Is it based on consent or is it majoritarian? Like how are decisions taken and what seems to be successful in mediating the group and what doesn't really?
Okay, it's a very good question. My understanding, flat hierarchies, non-hierarchical structures are very important, potentially. And then you can have organic hierarchy. So for instance, there were 6 women and then they'll say, well, she knows she's old, she's been farming for 20 years, and so we defer to her. So you don't have a real hierarchy, but what you have is respectful hierarchy, if you like, of people who might know more. That you find they constantly, especially in Telangana, I asked them, but you've got this 75-year-old woman in your group. Isn't that a problem? No, we don't ask her to work, but we consult her all the time. So, so I think structurally, everybody needs to feel that they have a voice. And then if you have a natural deference. Does that answer your question? There was another part to your question.
If it's consent based or if everyone agrees.
As we know from the women's movement, if you have 20 women, we'll end up not always agreeing, and you can spend 3 hours trying to convince everybody. But I think there's a practicality of it, in more formal context, not so much in the Indian context, but in the French context, just go by majority and say, if somebody is being particularly stubborn, you just have to say, look, okay, we'll make a decision. We're not going to spend 6 years trying to convince you. Okay. So those rules matter, any democratic functioning, right? And did you have anything to say?
No, I was just going back to the partnerships when you were saying about it was mainly the men that were over the partnership, the farm manager, but and 44% of farm partnerships is actually a female partner. So I think that is quite positive.
Is that right?
Yes, 44.
You have the figures, thank you. That's amazing, okay. Okay. Which is what, female partners, meaning a mother and daughter, or?
No, and all the partnerships in Ireland, there was at least one female partner in 44% of,
at least one.
yes.
Okay. Well, I think that would be a very interesting project to see whether there are differences in functioning. That's quite a large number. It's very encouraging.
I just want to ask actually a question about that. Is that just like a titular partner, or are they actually like in practice?
I don't know. I just got that figure recently from the Department of Agriculture, so it's only the percentage that I've got from them so far, so I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Yeah, it's a good question because you have in your structure, what I've read is that you have the 3 categories of partners, right? The one was the main one who owns the land and so on. And then you have partner 2, which can be a younger farmer, who can apply for a loan, and then there'd be a 3rd partner. Or you can have 1 category partners. So I would imagine if women don't own land very much, that they're a supplementary partner rather than the main partner, although maybe there are cases where there's no son and the daughter might inherit.
But it's encouraging that they're part of the decision-making process, so that
Yes.
they're actually an actual partner. Because I'm quite surprised to see that percentage myself. I didn't think it would be quite as high.
Yes.
I thought maybe on paper it would be, a lot of them are family partnerships, but it would be the male members of the household that would be listed as the partners, and that even the female wouldn't be included. So at least.
Yes, I think that's very good. And Anya and I visited a family where you had this mother and father and son had 33% partnership. And the woman was she was very hands-on and part of the decision making and pretty strong. So we might be surprised in terms of what we imagine what is the case.
Yeah, it's the combination of those cases, I think, that really, and we've studied those in that paper with Tanya as well. They're really paradigmatic in terms of what they represent, transformed relationships and power relationships. But then there are those who, and we discussed this, Bina, those who, they enter into a partnership in order to gain rights to a pension.
Yes.
Often very well deserved for the enormous amount of work these women have contributed all their lives, which we know from annual statistics. But that is not to say that they really do have an equal role in decision making. So, it's various cases, various types.
Various types. No, thank you. Jivanta, did you welcome and
thank you.
did you have any? I know you missed.
No, I was listening on my way. Technology, it's amazing. I managed to follow almost all the presentation. I suppose I missed out a little bit on the part where you were talking about your survey and this
Yes.
incredible amount of data which you collected. So I suppose you did talk about that and how you use that data. So
Yes.
I won't pursue that point. Maybe from the Indian perspective, you know, I'm a political scientist and I was following the huge uproar about the farm laws and, you know, the push that the government is trying to modernize so how do these, have you noticed, do these issues now filter upwards to the government level? Are they maybe not just focusing on how to make agriculture more efficient through?
Yeah, you know,
mechanization?
because India's, thank you, India is so federated, you know, we have
Mhm.
26 states or more. Yeah.
Growing, yeah.
So you, in Kerala, it's the entire state. It's like one country in Europe. I mean, every district of Kerala has group farms. That's why they end up with 68,000 plus. In other states, you know, I've been trying to talk to people in the Niti Aayog to say this can be a transformative model. The NGOs are very, civil society is very open. So in Eastern India, I got this email in 2015, you know, from the head of the International Water Management Institute saying, Professor Agarwal, we read your 2010 paper and we love the design principles and we decided to try them out in group farms in Eastern India. Would you like to come to the workshop? So I'm still in touch with them and the scaling up issue came up. Do you build a spine? They're doing that. So at that level, but they're small in numbers. You really want people to take it up. And so it really depends on where your contacts are and in terms of the model. And so, you know, the more examples you have, the better it is, it seems to me, right? And so we'll see. I mean, I'm quite passionate about it. And I feel it can be transformative. I do feel that, but let's see, it's hard work. The one thing I have to keep telling people when I'm doing a workshop is that it's not an easy thing. Don't just assume that you can go and you can talk to a group of villagers and group farming. You have to have proper design principles. You have to provide the kind of support they need because after all, it is their lives and livelihoods. And you can't fail that. So once they do that, then hopefully in another 5 years' time, we'll be in a better space by the time I finish my book. Please.
So my question was, firstly, thank you so much for this. As somebody who doesn't really have any background in agricultural at all, let alone kind of women's role in group farming, it's been really interesting. But the question I have may stretch the data in a way that it is not possible to do so. So I mean, you might not be able to fully answer this question. But I was interested in the way that you're looking at both kind of caste and religion. And it made me also think about the role of disability within group farming for women. And in two ways. So in the one is that this kind of group farming may provide actually a possibility for livelihood, for empowerment and so forth of women with certain types of disabilities in that they can share work and so forth. And then on the other side of it, you have the possibility that somebody becomes disabled after they are already engaged in a group. And I suppose reflecting on you know, the potential penalties around not being able to participate, I wondered how that also might impact on women with disabilities. So there's kind of two parts to that question.
Yeah, it's very difficult. The farming in India is quite labor intensive. I mean, the mechanization part is tractors, you plow. But if you're growing rice, then you're still doing quite, you know, you may have some machines, but otherwise typically, this has gone off my slide, but there was a slide where you say Kudumshri, they're standing up and using a power tiller. Whereas the first slide was everybody was bending down. So women can stand up. I always use that as a contrast. So it's quite difficult to have, if you're physically disabled. I mean, you can be old and you feel you're frail and you're part of the group. And if you provide the wisdom, they account for that. But on other things, I don't think it would. At least there's been no discussion on that. And it seems to me it would be really difficult to incorporate that. But, you know, there's always potential because such a person could be very good in managing sales. Suppose you have something you're selling online. In France, there were disabled who participated. So I remember this one farm where there were 4 people who were partners, and he had had an accident. So he sat in the drawing room in front of a monitor, and they were using robots for milking. So he controlled the cows just by sitting there. He was able to do that. So there was so if it's more technically sophisticated, then there would be, I think it would be more possible. The women in the Indian farmers at the moment, I don't think. I would imagine there's a big challenge for that. And you can do other things. Farming is still manual. Then a lot of manual work is involved. A lot of walking through the fields and so on is involved.
So if it were to happen that someone became disabled in the course of, say, the work on the farm or so forth, would they then be expected to leave the group?
I'm only conjecturing.
Yeah.
The likelihood is yes, because they lease in land. So the risk of leasing in, if they own the land together and pooling it, there would be probably more possibility. I do know that they're very supportive of each other. If somebody falls ill, is in hospital, they go and visit her and so on and so forth. And in one case, when I asked this woman, what are the advantages? She said, in all these 30 years of marriage, he never took me to the cinema. He took me to the cinema. You can imagine that's a benefit, but in fact, it meant that the relationship became more of a partnership. So I'm sorry, I think it's a very good question. I think more mechanized systems probably allow for disability participation than more manual systems, I would say. Yeah. Yes, please. Well, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I was wondering, Bina, thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. I am a nutrition scientist, so I come at this whole area from a slightly different angle. And I was just wondering if you could comment on whether other actors in the food system, the wider food system, like food processors, or I suppose food processors, we just focus on them. Do they have a role to play or should they have a role to play in supporting group farming? I'm just wondering, because I suppose I'm coming from the point of view of, say, the food system summit that happened in 2021, and there's very little representation from producers. And I was just wondering, do you have, at sort of global political scale, do you have any insights into how group farming should be supported, would be supported by other actors?
No, I think group farming does have a role. I mean, it's slightly higher up in the value chain. So suppose in Ghana you have cocoa producers. The banana contracts actually work very well because these are niche bananas which are sold to temples, and the women entered into contracts and they could deliver. Yeah. They deliver particularly in certain seasons, which they wouldn't have been able to deliver otherwise. And then you couldn't say, well, you can have some processing because banana chips are very popular. You can sell them in packets. You can actually buy them in packets. So you could scale it up, and you could have another group, which is more an entrepreneurial group, and link up with the group farm, and they produce the bananas, and these guys may be producing the chips. So I think there is, at short value chains, there is potential. There could be also, India is one of the, Kerala is one of the top states in India on banana production, and we also export bananas. So at that level, again, you can either export bananas, you can export banana chips. Have any of you eaten banana chips? Yes, you like them? Yes. There you are.
They are high value operations.
Not necessarily. Actually, banana chips is not high value. It's a cottage industry. I mean, your packaging has to be good and clean and all of that, but it's not that sophisticated. You don't need huge factories.
Yeah, but you see the chocolate in Ghana,
Yeah.
that went into high value.
Yeah, I think some of these products have a lot of value with consumers. So the final end point of the food system, I suppose.
Well, you could trademark it saying this is a women's cooperative, or you could always brand it in that way. Some things are branded.
Yeah.
Even in India. But I do think I think connections with other groups. I suppose we see a chain of groups. You have group farms, we produce it and they link up with the processing group of women, if you like, or mixed, and then go up. There would be, it could work really well. Yeah.
I just have another question on social capital,
Yes.
just on the age of the farmers. And I know you said that
Age, yes.
there's a lot of, I'm sure
Yes,
the data
yes.
has age disaggregation, but in a lot of other countries, I suppose it's hard to keep any young people, male or female, in rural areas. So would it be attractive for young farmers as well? You know, are younger people, male or female?
So here's,
You know what I mean?
I think it could. These are not very old, these are middle level women, but they don't have a lot of young children, which helps because you don't have their, so you would be in your 30s. What is very interesting is that in Eastern India, the Bihar, West Bengal, it's a very feudal system. So what has happened is many other advantages. When they negotiate with the landlord, these are mixed groups, men and women, negotiate a landlord, they're able to bring down the rent, and they're also able to say our wives are not going to come and work for free in your household. This is really brutal. So that has helped. And also when I visited, we had a youth group which had formed, and they used to migrate to Mumbai for cities. And, cities are so inhospitable for young people in housing and this and that. And they decided they would stay back and they would form a group. Now, there were certain things which happened because in this area, the International Water Management Institute introduced mechanized irrigation. And that enabled them to grow vegetable crops for 3 months and sell it locally. So that's, even if you do it for 3 months, you actually earn quite a lot. So there is a potential for making it, if you like, more attractive for younger people who don't want to soil their hands and want to see it as slightly higher tech. You have to sell it as of some prestige, and I think I do think that would be pretty important. I don't know whether in Ireland that's an issue, how sexy is farming and so on. But technology always fascinates people, right?
It's not sexy.
But the technology fascinates, right? If it was, I have this picture which in Canada, this woman, enormous machinery, enormous tractor with 50 different things. So you just have to pull levers and you can do everything, right?
Probably selling from their or selling from their others. Yeah, people probably selling from their farms as well. Healthy foods and that.
That's
Fashionable.
Yeah, that's fashionable. In India, it's never. Yes. I don't buy from supermarkets. Most of us are still not buying from supermarkets. We buy from, just go to the market and they'll have their fresh produce.
They sometimes sell through supermarkets as well.
Right.
Farms, so it's
Yes.
becoming more popular.
So I think we should induct younger people, and then one of the ways Ireland has been doing is very good because you're saying, okay, you have to green cert, which Chavez is giving, and that automatically I have a degree or some kind of a technical skill which others don't have, and I think that's always prestige making. Thank you. Did you have somebody else? No.
Well,
Yes,
I mean, actually, just with regards to this conversation, have you been seeing reports about Chinese cases? Because I remember reading a similar phenomenon of young people fed up with city life, the harshness of competitivity, moving to the countryside. And I wondered, they've gone through so many revolutions in China. Is there now this return? And women are also more empowered compared to other Asian countries in China. So,
I have not heard of reverse migration in the context of China, but I have colleagues who. So here's what's happening in China from one or two of the papers I've read, which is that they are not they're not doing group farming in this way. They give the land to the local council,
to the
so if
village.
you have 10 of us, 15 of us, and they have managers. They call agricultural production cooperatives, APCs, in fact. And I have a Chinese student who wants to work on it. So she's emailing today. So it's a very different model. They're not sitting and having a lot of participative decision making and so on. And people are older. I mean, people are getting old. So they give over the land. They don't want to lose the land. And the household responsibility system has changed because earlier it used to be constantly redivided, but then the laws change in China. Yeah, but it's interesting. I'd love to hear more from you about this reverse. Yes.
Part of this is for based farming as
Where?
so has there been if
Is there any discussion on this?
yeah.
You know, Indians love cows. We love milk, but most of agriculture is crops in any case. So yes, people talk about it and, you know, there's issues of methane and so on and so forth. But I would imagine that it's on a, regionally we have concentrations where there's more dairy. But I think it's much more dominant outside in Europe and the US. That's where I would start. Yes.
I was wondering how would group farming work in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, because I've seen how they do group farming. It's more like cooperative across the value chain, like in terms of production, but in terms of owning the land, like different families own land. But in this case, from the model you presented, it seems like the land is leased to the group and then they work on it. So how would it work in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, wherein you have the feminization of agriculture? And two, if agriculture should be mechanized, would you, in sub-Saharan Africa, would we see the reverse, just like how it's happening now in Europe? Because when agriculture is mechanized, it becomes masculinized also. It becomes masculinized, becomes male dominated when it's mechanized, and the women will be kicked out of it.
Right.
So how can we make the?
So I think it is a lot of relevance for sub-Saharan Africa because the farms are small, and especially for the women who don't own much land, as you saw from the statistics. You can, you know, but you may not own it, but then you have lease right. You have rights to it either through the clan or the extended family. That there are a lot of only women-headed farmers in sub-Saharan Africa who could potentially come together. I think it could be a model which could be very successful in sub-Saharan, because the reasons for that, you know, the very small scale of farm, the potential for productivity, solidarity would work. For some reason, I haven't found examples. I've been looking for that. The mechanization in itself doesn't throw women out. It's so in India, nobody is using animal traction anymore. They're all doing, I mean, everybody's using tractors. You're just not owning the tractor, you're leasing the tractor. So, and you can have, you know, you can have mechanized transplanting of rice and so on. It's really who controls the machines that matters. So in the earlier example, which I was giving historically, what happened was that nobody was talking about working in groups and production. So when families who were harvesting together no longer needed to harvest together because the machine could replace you, then they went in for mechanization without the institutional change. We didn't talk about partnerships, but you could talk about partnerships. Most people are leasing in power tillers, all the machines that these small groups are doing, and then very importantly, Puma in France has these machine cooperatives. So farmers come together, they buy machines together, and they say, okay, if Nata says I'm going to use 20% of the time, I say I use 30, and says another 30, how much is that? 80, and then Anya says another 20. And we buy a machine together. And we pay for it accordingly. So you can have machine cooperatives. And in fact, Puma emerged much before GAIX did in France. As well, in Canada has, I think you have Puma, do you have, no? You looked at the model in Ireland, but Canada has a lot of Puma.
In Cork,
In Cork,
In Cork,
machinery
yeah.
cooperatives
Yeah.
started up, so there's quite a few of them in the south and particularly in Cork.
Where they're needed.
Yes, yeah.
But
Just-
larger farms. Yeah, and there are traditions then that it's not because it's not a good idea and it wouldn't work in theory, or, you know, considering the existing cooperative relations. It's just that there was an established business of farm contractors that worked, so the farmers didn't have their, some of the big machinery anyway, but people had carved a niche where they actually filled that
Yes.
need and were working very successfully in their
Right.
activities. So lots of different reasons.
Yeah, so they're very good, different models. You can form a machine cooperative. Maybe the women may not buy a large tractor, but they could buy a power tiller together if they wanted their own and link it with other groups. The other model is that individual farmers buy. In India, you have government cooperatives, but the machines are not well maintained. So you have individual farmers whose land is small and too small to use it fully, so they lease it out. And in some of our papers, you'll find that the women are complaining that these tractor owners give priority to the male farmers and not to the women farmers. So that's another model. Should not be a constraint to forming groups. In fact, that would be a reason why, if you came together as a group. And there's a lot of economies in irrigation.
And Bina, also getting back to your point earlier with regard to if there's subsidies or if the government supports certain schemes a number of decades ago, machinery cooperatives in Ireland were very popular in smaller farms in the west of Ireland because the government gave small grants for particular machines to be bought between farmers. So even my late father and a neighbour had a number of machines between them, and it worked really well that the haymaking season, and the families also helped out, you know, the different households as well as the machines going across the different fields. The children went and other family members and helped out. So it was quite popular in the west of Ireland in maybe the 70s and the 80s.
I'll drop you lines and then you can connect me to that. It's wonderful.
So I think the conversation can continue for a very long time, but I think we looked at great care. I know some people have to go and some of you have to eat. We are talking about food, agriculture. I just want to thank everyone for coming. It's been a really fantastic discussion. And Bina, you're excellent as always. And Gillian,
Yeah.
there is not a single event that we do that cannot be done without Gillian's support. So I really want to thank Gillian for all the hard work you did.
Absolutely. Galway and
DC.
Dublin City University.
Yeah.
All of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.